if I hear a motorbike backfiring, fireworks are the worst, or even bad weather, thunderstorm, I get really uneasy. And actually, most Ukrainians have the same reaction. Like my hands shake if a car bangs, someone even bangs a door. So I clearly have some trauma that I need to process, and that sort of thing takes a bit of time.
My guest today is Dame Melinda Simmons, the British ambassador to Ukraine since 2019. Prior to her current post, Dame Simmons has worked in the UK civil service for over 20 years, having held posts at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as well as the Department for International Development, where she worked on projects that included land restitution in the former Soviet Union. Dame Simmons has used her considerable online platform to speak out against anti-Semitism. Dame Simmons, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Kind of tired. It's quite busy here, but good to be on. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. And look, obviously, I think we are going to have to start our conversation with some discussion of the war in Ukraine, particularly as it relates to anti-Semitism. Now, many of us will be familiar with the assertions made by Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in which he has compared Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to Nazis and has referred to the so-called denazification of Ukraine. Now, not only was this discourse rife at the beginning of the war, but it has also appeared repeatedly, including from Russia's foreign minister, and also more recently again from the Russian president, with pushback from President Zelensky. Let me ask you, how are these claims received by Ukrainians, both Jewish and non-Jewish?
So thank you. And it's a really complex question because I'm going to say that this was denazification has not been an objective for Russia. They may have repeated it over and over again, but that's not their objective. It is a narrative, one of several fairly paranoid and baseless narratives that they have used about Ukraine. And they fish them out every so often, I don't know, depending on the day of the week. They did abandon the use of denazification for some time, all the way through the second half of last year, and then came back to it again. They veer away from it, they come back to it. But it's pretty clear they're not here to rid the country of Nazis. They are here to subjugate the whole of Ukraine for daring to pursue its independence and dare to be a part, if you like, of Western Europe and Euro-Atlantic integration. That's really what the objective is. So in general, the answer is that it's not received with any kind of credibility here in Ukraine. And that's not just because the country is run by a president who identifies as Jewish. It's generally because there is a deep skepticism from right across Ukraine about any narrative that Russia uses as a justification for coming into the country and killing thousands of people for being Ukrainian. Among Jews, it's the same, and I can't speak for all Jews in Ukraine. I have not met all Jews in Ukraine, and it's a very disparate range of communities. But I will say that among those that I've met in Kiev, there is the same skepticism, but there is also a thread of fear about it. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Ukraine is the epicenter of the Holocaust, right? This is a country that lost pretty much nearly all of its Jews in the Holocaust. I've been here 4 years. Every town I go to, every town has a killing field. Every forest has a shooting site. It's unbelievable, really, for someone from Western Europe to be walking around finding so much consistent evidence of killing of Jews. And that is something that runs deep, even though the country has not gone through the same conscious coming to terms with what has happened as many Western European countries have. I mean, Ukraine hasn't done that. Most of Eastern Europe, frankly, hasn't really done that yet. So Jews who are here, who have that memory, and there are many Jews here who don't come from that, but those who do, older Jews who are here for that, there is always a twinge of fear about what that means, because what they do know is if the worst happened and Russia did, which they won't, by the way, in my opinion, but if they did, if they were able to come to urban centres and occupy, it would very quickly translate itself into the sort of anti-Semitism that we have seen inside Russia.
Right. And you spoke there about the history of Ukraine and the Holocaust. Now, your family came from Kharkiv in Ukraine, where under Nazi occupation, thousands of Jews were murdered at Drobytsky Yar. The memorial at Drobytsky Yar was damaged by Russian shells following the invasion of Ukraine. When this happened, you drew attention to it on Twitter. When you first heard news of the shelling, how did this make you feel? And were your feelings matched by your contemporaries?
So I went to Drobytsky Yar in November of my first year here, and I went to pay a symbolic visit. I knew that part of my mother's family had come from Kharkiv, but I had no expectation of finding any information out about them. There was just too little that existed, and frankly, they left about 120 years ago. I just wasn't expecting to find anything. But I did find my family name on that memorial. So it turned into what was going to be a sort of symbolic visit, actually became deeply personal to me and was a most extraordinary moment.
Wow.
And so was the moment when I told my mum about it. It was, it was really quite oddly special because, of course, what happened, therefore, to those people is the worst that you can imagine happening. But at the same time, it fills a gap in your understanding of your family history. So that was special. And therefore, when the memorial itself was hit, I remember thinking that it felt like my extended family had been murdered for a second time. And I was very angry. It's actually the moment last year when I was at my angriest, which should be irrational, because by then I'd been to Butcher and I'd been to Irpin and I'd seen these massacre sites from the first phase of the Russian invasion, and I was deeply emotional when I went to those places. But real anger I felt when Drobytsky Yar was hit. I was actually in Kharkiv not long ago, and I saw the damaged memorial, twisted, menorah with its kind of branches to have splayed, and it had rubble around it, and it's deeply upsetting. I had colleagues with me in Kharkiv, not Jewish, who were every bit as moved by it.
Yeah. Good Lord. I mean, I've got to ask you, what has your experience of being in Ukraine during this war been like as a whole?
It's been really quite tough on the one hand because I didn't expect to have to run for shelter, and power stations near you might be hit and you wouldn't have access to water, so access to heat, access to light. People that you knew would lose their lives in missile attacks on apartments. People that you knew would be killed on the front line. So far, 8 people that I know well have lost their lives. That's 8 more, frankly, than almost my entire life, really, of people who have been killed, fighting in a war. And so all of that, it changes you a little bit. But the thing that saves it is the virtuous cycle that comes from working in a country full of people so utterly determined to defend their independence and to do everything possible towards it, no matter where you are. I could be in Lviv and I'd be having the same conversation in the west of Ukraine, or I've traveled as far east as I can go. I've been north and I've been south, and I hear and see the same things. Everyone around you is doing something towards the war effort. That makes you very motivated to do even more of your own work. So that's what I mean by virtuous cycle. But it's a counterbalance for what you often have to endure by being here. Although, to be fair, the biggest thing I've had to endure between COVID and then the war in Ukraine is 3.5 years of separation from my family, which was never going to be part of the plan.
That sounds really, really tough. And, my condolences for the losses that you've had. Last year, you were evacuated from Ukraine after already moving from Kiev to Lviv for your own safety. What was that like? What did it feel like when you were evacuated? What was going through your mind at the time?
Well, I was evacuated when instructed to do so. I was told to leave Kiev, and I'd already told myself that if I was told to leave, I would go. I don't work for myself. I work for the government. British government tells me I must go, then it's my job to go. So that's why I moved back to Lviv. And the same thing, when I was instructed to pull back to Poland, that's what I did. But it was unbelievably hard because there is a huge psychological importance attached to diplomatic missions staying inside the country. So I wanted to be really careful to explain to people we were pulling back only as far as we needed to, and would do whatever help we could from the other side of the border. And as soon as we possibly could, we were coming back in. That was quite a brave thing to say, given that Russian tanks were rolling, towards Kiev at the time when we were pulled back to Poland. But it is true that many other missions went back to their capital cities, and we didn't. We stayed in Warsaw, and we also had people deployed near to the border to help with humanitarian assistance. And it's also true that the very minute it looked as if there was scope to go back to Kiev, I went back to Kiev. So I wasn't out of the country for very long. Nonetheless, when I was taken out with my other colleagues, there were 5 of us by then who were taken out to Poland. There is an absolutely vivid and probably one of the saddest memories I've had of the war so far, of when we were approaching the Polish border and I began to pass Ukrainians who were abandoning their cars because the queue to get out was so long, and they were wrapping their children in blankets and several coats. And there were other children who had massive backpacks on their backs, or they were carrying laundry bags, or they were pushing wheelbarrows. Very vivid, evocative memories, actually, of pictures that you've seen of World War II. And we passed that, streams and streams and streams of people, and it was bitterly cold. It's very exposed territory. It's not forested. It's very bare in the approach that we took to the Polish border. And so these people had heads down against this bitter wind and were walking their way to the border. And I cried my eyes out all the way through to the border. I felt terrible about what I was seeing, just to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds horrible. That sounds absolutely traumatizing. And you've been in Ukraine now for, gosh, coming on 4 years. You announced on Twitter that you will be leaving your ambassadorial role in August. How are you feeling about leaving, and what have some of the highlights of your career been?
It's fine to be leaving because, of course, it's difficult to go. But if you feel you've done a good job in any job, then it's always difficult to leave it. And this has been an amazing job, and therefore it's difficult to leave it. But the person who's taking over from me is brilliant. So, we'll continue to do brilliant stuff. So that's okay. It's not like you get any sense that you're abandoning people if you know that you're part of a bigger effort, which is what the civil service is anyway. You are part of a bigger effort and part of a team, and someone else is coming to take over. That's all great. But at the same time, I've also made so many friends in this country that, these are friendships that I'll take away with me. And I already know I'll be back. There are many of us, actually, ambassadors who are leaving this summer, just because there were, 10 or 12 of us who started a 4-year tour in 2019, just around the same time as President Zelensky started his new job as president. We came in. And we have all discussed that we are coming back for a reunion after victory, and we mean it. So there isn't a sense of never being a part of this again.
Yeah, that's really nice. It sounds like you've got a real community around you.
Yes.
Now, being an ambassador who has had a career that has taken you around the globe, a lot of people might be curious as to your impressions of how anti-Semitism manifests differently around the world. Can you tell us a bit about your experiences of being Jewish in Ukraine, as well as the other places that you've been to?
Um, yeah, I guess so. So uh, it would be weird to say this, but it doesn't really come up. It's I have tried different communities when I've been here in Kiev, and one of the things that because it's important to me to be part of community, and one of the things that you notice when you are part of communities here is A, that there are loads and loads of them, but B, that the majority of them have evolved post-war, and there are many people here who were, not part of the original community, and so you get a real sense of, I'm sorry to say, but Hitler really having done his job in countries like Ukraine, of having so completely eviscerated communities. You really get that sense here. But you also get an amazing sense of renewal from some of those smaller communities. And I fixed a mezuzah on the wall of a building for a Masorti community in the middle of last year. I mean, they came back during the invasion and came back to a new property, and I put the mezuzah up. That was a fantastic thing to do at any time. It's a lovely thing to do, but during a war, putting a mezuzah up is such a symbol of hope and such a symbol of future, really, that that's the paradox that is Ukraine right now. It's incredible that they could be fighting for their lives, and I still keep seeing new cafes being open, for example. So
Wow.
being Jewish isn't no, really, there are at least 10 new cafes in my own area that weren't there before the war. They're very determined people.
Amazing.
I, it's not difficult in that sense to be Jewish. In terms of attitudes, it's you find kind of broadly two sets of attitudes, and one is a kind of that it's invisible, that being Jewish is invisible, you just don't think about it, with the sort of set of preconceptions that are largely quite benign, and because being Jewish here is defined as a nationality, which is really interesting. When I went to Western Ukraine, I was given a briefing on Western Ukraine about the demographics, and I remember seeing that it said it had X number of Poles, and X percentage of Romanians, and X percentage of Germans, and X percentage of Hungarians, and X percentage of Jews. And I remember asking the person
Wow.
who gave me this brief, how do you know if those Jews are Polish Jews or Ukrainian Jews or German Jews or Hungarian Jews? No, they're just Jews. So I had to have a whole conversation with people who have PhDs in, sociology and economics, etc., who could not describe this to me other than that traditionally Jewish is described as nationality. So the issue, of course, with that is, and of course, you don't have to declare as a nationality, but it is described as a nationality.
Yeah.
So the problem with that is, of course, that if you isolate being Jewish as nationality, then that leads to preconceptions and issues that can absolutely sound and look anti-Semitic, even if people here may not recognize it as such. And so one of the bugbears I've had in the 4 years I've been here is that you can still buy very easily matryoshkas, those dolls that you open up and there's another doll inside it,
Yes.
the little wooden things. You can easily buy matryoshkas that show a Hasid clutching a money bag with a pointed nose and hooked ears,
Are
etc.
you
You can
serious?
get those from a tourist shop that is. No, no, I'm serious. That you can get those. You can get those during the war, actually, among the souvenir shops that have reopened. You can find them in Warsaw too, by the way. It's a trend. It's a thing that has not gone from this region. So I think one of my most profound challenge being a person who identifies as being Jewish here has been that I've had to set aside my understanding of what it means to be comfortably Jewish in the UK and try to understand why things that would look so unbelievably insensitive might exist as a sort of mainstream part of society. I mean, in 2019, I remember having a colleague who told me that they had a little matryoshka with a Jew with money bags on it. And I remember asking why they had it and was told that they called it their lucky Jew and they took it along with them for job interviews. So when you've got that, you've got to tread a road in which you have to set aside your own historic understanding and start talking about why that might be seen very differently by, say, me. And I have had further conversations with colleagues and friends here, Ukrainians, who would tell me subsequently that they've never understood it that way. And were only now, if you like, beginning to understand that that might be a sensitive thing. I mean, there is a cinema in Chernivtsi, which is an absolutely beautiful city, smallish city in the southwest of Ukraine. It's a cinema of about 4 floors. It's absolutely massive, but it used to be called the synagogue because that was the main synagogue of Chernivtsi. And then during the Holocaust, of course, everybody was taken away. And so it was converted into a cinema, and the local population call it the cinemagogue. And it hasn't occurred to any of them that that might be an insensitive thing to
Right.
call it.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit baffled because obviously in Britain, I think that just would not fly. Is there a sense from the Jewish community in Ukraine that this offends them, that this is not okay? And if so, what has the response to that been?
The thing about being a British Jew hearing it is that it all sounds really offensive, and objectively it is offensive. But I'm in a country, and this is not to excuse it, okay, but we have actually got a job to do to understand it. I'm in a country that has been occupied for decades, and Russia, that occupied Ukraine, has taken every conceivable step during that occupation to minimize or even disappear that Holocaust history. So there's no sense of it being taught in schools. For you're talking about, 70 or 80 years, it's not been recognized. Babin Yar is only about a 20-minute train ride from here, for example. And when I first came here in 2019, all there was there was one menorah that had been put up only about 10 years previously. There was nothing else to tell you that it was still the site of the biggest massacre by bullets in history. No one would know it. There were beer bottles in the base of the ravine, and I saw little kids riding their tricycles over the steps to the menorah, and no memory. One of the biggest differences since Zelensky administration began is that there has been a focus on consciousness and understanding of seeing what there is through different eyes. Babin Yar is no longer Babin Yar. It's now the Babin Yar Memorial Park. It has brand and it has name, it has information, it has installations. It looks completely different from how it did in 2019. You cannot walk into that area now and not know what happened. In 2019, you could have walked all the way through and thought, wow, this is a really lovely park, and sat down in the ravine and eaten your picnic and not known any better. That's the thing, is that the consciousness journey has barely begun in countries like Ukraine. Ukraine isn't alone that way. And nor have they yet had the conversation about collaboration either. Even that is only just beginning. So when I'm often criticized for trying to give this perspective, and people say, yeah, but what about Ukrainians who were part of it? And it is factually the case that Ukrainians were recruited and were part of it. The answer has to be, this has to be part of the painful and difficult conversation that a country has to have with itself. And the fact that the UK might be in one position about anti-Semitism, and many countries in Eastern Europe are way not in that position, I'm afraid we are the ones who have to take several steps back and look at the journey of consciousness and education that needs to happen. It's not a situation where you turn around and you castigate a country because they haven't taken those steps and they've just got to get with the program.
Well, it sounds like Ukraine finally is taking the steps, as you just said. President Zelensky, his efforts to introduce Holocaust education. I'm not sure ironic is the word, but it's very telling what Russia's intentions are, given that the narrative was the denazification, even though President Zelensky has taken steps to improve Holocaust education.
Well, I guess Russians have been very clever at adapting narratives and twisting them around, one or two facts. So, in theory, the sort of the most analytical that you could say about it is that it stems from Ukrainian nationalism as it manifested itself during the time of the National Socialists, when there was evidence of some collaboration with National Socialists in return for independence. Kind of so goes the story. In fact, the Nazis ended up throwing most of those Ukrainian nationalists in Sachsenhausen, or they executed them at Babin Yar, interestingly. So it didn't end well, that attempt at collaboration. But it is true that anti-Semitism was a part of that ideology. And I still have that conversation with friends and colleagues in Ukraine where I say that and they deny it. And we have to have that conversation in a very repeated way, even just to accept that. And of course, what they say to me is, but they were put in Sachsenhausen. And I have to say, I know, and as weird as it sounds, those that survived it came out anti-Semitic. And I can't explain to you how that's possible to go to a concentration camp, come out and go, yeah, that's a good thing to do with people who aren't purely Ukrainian. I still can't get my head around that historical context. But in terms of the question that you're asking me, so what's happened here is that your kind of evidence that there was an anti-Semitism within that ideology gets taken out and made a central thing. It's not in any way a central, even these days marginal, part of the Ukrainian narrative about what and who Ukraine is. And that's what makes this not just a false comparison, but it's a pretty egregious disinformation that Russia uses as a basis for a mass murder that they're currently engaged on. And if you do, if the term Nazism evokes anything in your head, then it really is painful. It's painful enough engaging in helping Ukraine to defend itself against this onslaught. It's even worse, really, to have that history thrown back at you in a pretty denigrated state.
Mm. We read so much about this in the media, but it's actually really, really interesting to hear it from you, a Jewish person who's actually on the ground in Ukraine. So thank you very much. I want to ask you, you've spoken about how community is important to you. What has your Jewish life looked like in other countries? Your experience of being a Jew look like around the world?
This is my first time posting to Eastern Europe, and so it's been completely different. But for example, I was posted to South Africa, and it was completely normal. But then, it wasn't war. I had my family with me. Everything in terms of practicing as a Jew was available. There was a lovely community we were a part of, etc., etc. And similarly, I spent some time in East Jerusalem, and there's no need to have a conversation about how you can be Jewish in Israel. There was an more interesting time when working on the Middle East, where you had an underlying sense of needing to justify to people that you were able as a civil servant to work impartially on issues that people may have preconceptions that you wouldn't be impartial about, but that was not impossible to do. So I'm not going to pretend that there was some terrible debate I had to have with people. I didn't have to do that. There were undertones and there were questions, and I would simply answer those questions, and then I would bring in some Hamantaschen or some bagels and make it about my cultural background, so they would understand that for every Jew, the start and the beginning and end of their identity doesn't necessarily revolve around Israel. There are other things about being Jewish, and I would sort of introduce those. So the truth is
Yeah.
that for other places where I've been posted or lived, it's been pretty regular, and it's been more about adapting to sort of accents or different ways of running services or different ways of applying culture. But for sure, the most challenging in terms of this kind of blindness about being Jewish, Ukraine has been both the most challenging but also the most deeply interesting.
Mm. Yeah, it sounds it, and it's very clear speaking to you that your Jewish identity is very, very important to you. Can I ask, I'm very curious to learn a bit more about your Jewish upbringing. What was that like?
It was just conservative upbringing. Um, the family were members and still are of a United Synagogue. I'm not, I haven't been a United Synagogue member for years. I've been longer a member of Reform community than I was part of the United Synagogue. But that's how we were brought up in Essex, and all very, very kind of regular and kind of normal. I think the standout, which actually is the thing that made me move, as it were, it wasn't like a kind of walkout. It was about being female, and I clocked it very young. I first clocked the difference between women and men's participation when I was 7 years old, and I remember it very, very clearly, that moment. And from that time, really, I had questions in my head about why I had a secular life that was all about encouraging you to pursue any career you wanted and the very best of yourself and do anything and learn anything and any job. But if you stepped inside the synagogue, you had to sit at the back. Like, I just never, ever understood. Or you sat upstairs and you had to wear a hat and you didn't participate. You couldn't pick up the scroll. And never, ever bought this narrative of women have separate jobs that that part of the Jewish community would explain it away with. That's what drew me to a different Jewish community, and actually remains one of the core reasons why I love so much to be part of an egalitarian Jewish community.
Well, you're a member of Finchley Reform, and you've been attending services remotely. What has that been like for you?
Well, it started during COVID, so it was fine, right? I mean, we all experimented with it during COVID and discovered that there's more than one way that you can do this. And so I've been weirdly grateful to lockdown. I understand how controversial that sounds, but goodness me, I wouldn't want to go back through it. I really wouldn't, for the loneliness and the separation, because I was here in Kiev during that time, and I was, unexpectedly, and like many other people, forcibly separated from my family because I couldn't travel to them for 6 months, the longest I've ever been away from my partner, certainly the longest I've ever been away from my kids. It was horrible, but it really prepared me for this time where, they're not able to come in and stay with me. It takes me 3 days to get to see them, so it doesn't happen very often. But the connectivity that you get from being able to be online, that has been incredibly important. And having had the dry run during COVID, it's been really wonderful to be able to dial in to a service on Friday night, which is my favourite service. And quite often at the end of a really difficult week, particularly if there have been airstrikes in Kiev, or someone I know has been injured, or I've been working on a particularly difficult brief, to tune in and listen. And FRS is a very musical community, and just listen to the liturgy and listen to the music has been really helpful for me in balancing out a sense of calm and control and ease.
Good, good. I'm glad that I'm happy to hear that. Now, this year you were honoured as a Woman of Distinction by Jewish Care. What was that like for you?
Well, I wasn't at it because I couldn't get there. So I asked my
Ah,
parents to go. And so my mother and father went along, and so did my sister actually. And my mother made this absolutely beautiful speech. It was recorded, and someone sent it to me afterwards. My mother, I don't think, has made a speech for like 40 years or something. I can't remember the last time my mum had to stand up and say something. So I was so unbelievably proud of her, and she was completely brilliant. And she, she just explained what it was I was doing and why I couldn't be there, and then accepted this award. But I mean, of course, to be recognised was an incredibly lovely thing. I have my head down a bucket here. I work 7 days a week. I often work through the night. I'm so focused on some of the most basic things that need to be done here that it's quite hard for me to lift my head and look around and think of it as something that's not normal, because everyone around me here in Ukraine is doing exactly the same. So inside Ukraine doesn't feel special. But what the award did was remind me of what perhaps should be obvious, which is that to friends and contacts and other people in the UK, this absolutely isn't normal. So that was
yeah,
a lovely reminder of that.
that's great. I want to ask you now, to anyone who is thinking of a career in the British Foreign Service, what would you say?
Oh, come on down. Water's warm. It's such a fantastic career. What I can't promise that a glass ceiling has been smashed, and I can't promise that it isn't difficult from the point of view of many diversities, not just being Jewish. There are challenges, and particularly if you do what I do and you what all my colleagues do, and you go and live in another country. Any diversity in countries that perhaps are more patriarchal or or more conservative, you can have a mountain to climb. But one of the most extraordinary things about what draws people to diplomacy and diplomatic work is a curiosity about the world. And this experience I've had of being Jewish in Ukraine has challenged my understandings about being Jewish in the UK in a way that I think is really helpful. I have friends and family who think it's completely freaking mad, but if you're someone who has curiosity about how other people perceive your assumptions about life, well, then this is the career for you. And since I'm someone who quite likes those sorts of challenges, I think it's great.
Yeah, nice. That's awesome. As we begin to wind down now, I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all of our guests, which is, if someone who is not Jewish approaches you and says that they want to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where should they start?
Um, well, I always have one recommendation for everyone. It doesn't matter who they are, which is to call it out. That's the one thing that they can do, is to call it out. And when they ask what that means, what I say is, if you think there's a march going on, join the march. If you see something on social media and you're an active part of that social media, you say on your social media that it's not okay or that you're not comfortable with it. If you see something really bad, then you report it. If you saw someone being beaten up in the street, you would probably want to report that to the police. If you see the same sort of bullying going online, you probably should be doing the same. And I'm interested that people see a distinction there, because I don't.
Mm,
Most of our life is lived online in terms of that interaction now. I don't understand how people think it's their world on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok revolves around just those things. But if people that they know or like are experiencing that abuse, that's not part of their online world. It needs to be part of their online world, because all that's fantastic about social interaction online, I'm afraid, is integrated with all that's the worst of what's online. So that is what I ask people to do, to call it out.
yeah. Simple, easy, good advice. I like it. Now, please tell the listeners, what have you got going on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
Oh no, I'm disappearing. Like, I'm on annual leave in 2 years, and as I said, I've barely seen my family and friends, and I think it's enough for them to be worrying about me now. It's long enough. So
Yeah.
when I come back at the end of August, I have until the end of the year to reconnect and adjust to a normal life, and that isn't just about actually being with family and friends. It's also about becoming comfortable with calm. I notice when I do come out of Kiev, I have a team in Warsaw and I visit them, that if I hear a motorbike backfiring, fireworks are the worst, or even bad weather, thunderstorm, I get really uneasy. And actually, most Ukrainians have the same reaction. Like, my hands shake if a car bangs, someone even bangs a door. So I clearly have some trauma that I need to process, and that sort of thing takes a bit of time. That's what I'll be doing for the next few months. After that, let's see, hopefully another diplomatic posting.
Well, look, I really I wish you much luck on your journey. Dame Melinda Simmons, thank you so much for coming on Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Thanks so much for giving me the time. Been great to meet you.